Good afternoon, everyone. I remind you that the session is recorded. We are pleased to welcome you to this online session. This is part of the seminar series on liberalism and conservatism at a crossroads, exploring the notion of society and the individual from the 19th to the 21st century. Before introducing our speaker, I'd like to perhaps mention the organizers and their research units. So the seminar is organized by an inter-university team bringing together Catherine Marchal, her research unit is Agora at CY Cergy Paris University, Nathalie Champroux and Stéphane Porion, ICD University of Tours, Stéphane Revillier, Thiel University of Bourgogne, Europe, Karine Tournier-Sol, Babel University of Toulon, and myself from CRU, Sorbonne Nouvelle University. This seminar today is also supported by Roving Victorians. They support and promote research on in Victorian studies. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our speaker. So thank you, Stéphane. Stéphane Guy is a professor of English Studies and History at the University of Lorraine, where he is a member of the IDEA research unit in Nancy. His work focuses on political thought and on the complex relationships between intellectuals and ideologies, particularly in the 19th and early 20th century. He's the author of Genèse du travaillisme, la philosophie de l'histoire des Fabiens, published in 2019, and has co-edited several important collective volumes, including The Victorian Legacy in Political Thought, 2014, and Liberalism and/or Socialism, 2021. Today, Stéphane Guy will be speaking to us about socialism between conservatism and liberalism, exploring tensions and this shifting, often ambivalent relationship. Stéphane, thank you very much for being with us today. And the floor is yours. So I think you'd like to share your presentation.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Perfectly clear, yes.
Great. Okay, so well, thank you very much, Laurence, and thank you to the whole team. Thank you to each one of you for this warm welcome. I'm very honored to participate in this very stimulating seminar series. So I see there are a great many fascinating papers that have been given so far, and so I feel all the more honored to be delivering a paper in this for this particular session. So,
Stéphane, just before you start, you may want to begin the slideshow. We have the
I've got the slideshow possibility, yeah. Although there probably won't be a great need. I just hope it doesn't prevent me seeing the.
Let's try. Yeah, we can see you and your slides. Much
okay,
bigger. It's great. Thank you very much. Sorry.
Excellent, thank you. So socialism, liberalism, and conservatism have often been subject to different interpretations as to what distinguished them, but also as to what brought them together. One might quote, of course, Kolakowski's short piece in which he asserted that he was paradoxically all three, a supporter of all three, or the study of Immanuel Wallerstein on the overlaps between the three ideologies. From another perspective, there have been many studies on George Orwell's position in the left, based on his claim, and elaborated on by Jean-Claude Michéa, that he was a Tory anarchist. From yet another point of view, there have been attempts by Marxists to reconcile the idea of collective ownership with that of conservation, the conservation of nature, or with conservatism, think of G.A. Cohen, for instance. And of course, contemporary developments have shown how neoliberalism could go hand in hand with some form of protectionism. Think of Arnaud Aurin's study on what he calls le capitalisme de la finitude, or how populism draws both on the idea of tradition as well as on the emancipation of the masses from a so-called elite. So in this context, the late 19th century socialist revival offers food for thought in that it emerged as a response to a crisis of laissez-faire, and in that particular situation, new liberals, for instance, and socialists joined hands in their attempt at defining freedom in its connection with the community, and therefore to justify interventionism. On the other hand, historians like John Lawrence or Martin Pugh, among many others, have noted, in terms of political culture and practice, the deep interactions between the working class, the labor movement, and conservatism. So beyond the issues of sociability or political opportunism, I will seek to reassess how the socialist revival in the late 19th and early 20th centuries sought to reconcile two traditions or ideology, liberalism and conservatism, in its critique of laissez-faire. Lawrence Goldman has suggested that conservatives and socialists might have shared common ground in their protest against liberalism, but if I try to sum up his point, that the two never the twain shall meet. Conservatism was too static, hierarchical, paternalistic, he argued, to appeal to the working man. Now, I hope to go beyond this contention by exploring how a number of conservative and liberal tenets were merged in socialist argumentation, reasoning, although, of course, not systematically, as no ideology, for that matter, is absolutely consistent. Several introductory observations can be made. That a number of socialists formed alliances both with the liberals and with the conservatives, albeit opportunistically. One might think of the Tory gold scandal in 1885, of the Fabians' support for Balfour's Education Act in 1902, the Fabians seeking to permeate first the Liberal Party, but then in the 1890s, the Conservative Party. One might also think of Ruskin's well-known assertion that he was, quote, a violent Tory of the old school. And of course, imperialism, as Gregory Claes has shown, was far from being strictly a conservative precinct. These brief reflections lead me to suggest that the overlap between liberalism and conservatism in the socialist revival was something more than merely paradoxical, coincidental, or opportunistic. So my first point will be to highlight how the opponents of private ownership sought to harness liberal principles to their program. I'll then move on to argue that the socialist program was also based on a number of conservative assumptions or postures. And my last section will focus on the challenges or difficulties faced by socialism in its attempt at reconciling or merging the two traditions. So, however diverse it might have been, a defining feature of late 19th century socialism was the critique of laissez-faire economics. This model had failed to fulfill the promises of liberalism. And here I'll be adopting Michael Friedman's typology of liberalism. So socialists saw in collective ownership the completion of the true liberal ideals of emancipation. Most importantly, the individual might reconnect with his true self if the current system of unfair competition, waste, exploitation were replaced by social justice in property. Robert Blatchford, with his articles published as Merry England, expressed this belief in collective ownership as a means of liberation. He objected to the fact that means of production, distribution, and exchange were currently being held by, quote, a few rich men, not the people. Land, factories, railways, ships, machinery were being used, he said, to make wealth for the few rich men that own them. In Britain for the British, he went on to argue that despite the many existing trends, all socialists believed in, quote, property for the whole people, and that means of production should be, quote again, worked, managed, divided, and used by the people in such way as the greater number of the people shall deem best. Socialism, therefore, represented the perfect expression of self-determination and democracy. Here, Blatchford was also rooting socialism in the utilitarian tradition, which formed the groundwork for collectivism among a number of socialist theorists, among whom Sidney Webb. Before joining the Fabian Society in the mid-1880s, Webb had been a staunch supporter of philosophical radicalism. And in The Basis of Socialism Historic, published in the collection of Fabian Essays of 1889, Webb argued that the theory of rent broke the correlation between liberalism and social justice, at least a certain form of liberalism. Bentham, he said, whose economics were weak, paid no attention to the perpetual tribute on the fruits of others' labor, which full property in land inevitably creates. As a consequence, he argued, following the principle of the greatest happiness for the greatest number, the economists, the statesmen, the practical men had now come to understand that complete individual liberty with unrestrained private ownership of the instruments of wealth production is irreconcilable with the common weal. This meant recalibrating the understanding of freedom, which was now meant in what Friedrich Hayek described as the freedom from necessity, released from the compulsion of the circumstances, which inevitably limit the range of choice of all of us. That's what he wrote in The Road to Serfdom. Sidney Ball, the idealist who promoted Fabianism in Oxford, was also concerned to disprove any claim that socialism could mean denying individual fulfillment and competence. The aim of socialism was, he said, the organization of industry as shall make selection according to ability and character the determining factor in the remuneration of labor. He went on to advocate, competition of character and positive social quality. This ethical socialism informed the proto-environmental critique of capitalism put forward by Edward Carpenter, who also vindicated the principle of ownership in quasi-liberal terms. Socialism aimed at, quote, bringing the land of the nation into the possession of its rightful owners. He also contended in England's Ideal in 1884 that labor is as fruitful as ever, but the greater part of its produce, its reward, is taken from the worker. A deeper connivance correlation between liberalism and socialism was to be found in the issue of land, access to which constituted a natural right. A number of socialists were drawn to the collectivist crusade by reading or hearing the American economist and supporter of land nationalization, Henry George. In his attempt at resolving what he called the great enigma of our time, the coexistence of material progress and poverty, George believed that the injustice of society, not the niggardliness of nature, is the cause of the want and misery which the current theory attributes to overpopulation, unquote. In keeping with the radical aspiration to individual progress, he considered that only gradual taxation could restore social justice based on what he believed was the complete recognition of common rights to land. In this sense, socialists were keen to recall that before embracing his libertarian critique of the state, Herbert Spencer himself had, in Social Statics, advocated common ownership of land, since it was a natural right for individuals to use the earth. Beatrice Webb, the arch proponent of state socialism, throughout her life, continuously expressed her debt to Spencer and to his organicism, however diverging their views turned out to be on intervention. Another socialist critique of laissez-faire that flowed from a liberal mindset was the way in which it prevented the development of production and collective wealth. As the driving forces of liberalism, initiative and creativity were no longer possible, as private monopolies had evolved naturally from the free market. As William Clark put it, the mere forms of freedom remain, but monopoly renders them nugatory. Thus, we see that capitalism has cancelled its original principle, is itself negating its own existence. One of the main reasons for this contradiction was that liberalism had not factored in the implications of rent and interest, which meant that a whole class of non-productive landowners and capitalists had arisen, whose aim it was to maximize their profits by reducing production, by raising prices, or else by developing the output of luxury goods. This was stimulated by the demand of the wealthier classes when the many were starving. The resulting paradox, formulated by Bernard Shaw, was that while wealth and welfare are decreasing, productive power is increasing. The key issue here was the liberal idea of the individual as a contributor to collective well-being, partly inherited from Mill's conception of liberty. For Mill, the autonomy of man was not a name as such. The freedom for the individual to follow his own plans was inseparable from the benefits his emancipation could bring to society, leading Mill, as we know, to advocate collective ownership of land or utilities. A similar celebration of efficiency was voiced by William Morris and M.H. Heinemann in their summary of the principles of socialism in 1884. For them, anarchy in production and exchange has been driven to the last ditch of absurdity, since, they went on to say, a glut of goods exists on one hand, and men eager for those goods and anxious to work stand idle and foodless on the other. Morris's arts and crafts movement was itself precisely aimed at reconciling usefulness and labor, albeit with a critical outlook on mechanization. In News from Nowhere, one of the inhabitants contrasted utopian England with the decay and dereliction of late 19th century society. A concrete example of the efficiency of socialism was the fact that rivers were, in utopia, tended to, and reconciled beauty as a landscape, practicality as a means of transport, and availability in the use of rivers. Conversely, under capitalism, with the advent of profitable railways, rivers had ceased being taken care of and ended up in total dereliction. In short, the system, the narrator concluded, of production, the system of production for profit is a system of waste of time, waste of material, waste of human life. Sorry, that was these were the words of Morris himself, not his narrator, but Morris himself in one of his essays, Useful Work versus Useless Toil. Of course, a number of socialists were much more favorable to the productive capacity generated by industrial capitalism, invoking collective ownership as the achievement of man's thirst for prosperity through the mastery of nature. In this sense, competition was proving increasingly wasteful. The chief flaw of capitalism was the idleness that it spawned. First, as the positivist Sidney Olivier contended, in contradiction with the principle of collective wealth production, the shareholder, much like the rent-collecting landowner, broke with the work ethic that would allow prosperity to be increased and enjoyed by all. In his Fabian essay, Sidney Olivier contended that if the laws of property are I can do this on the PowerPoint, but if the laws of property are not to establish a parasitic class taking tribute from the labor of others in the forms of rent and interest, then we must modify our administration of property. But inefficiency was also to be found in the phenomenon of mass unemployment, the necessary outcome of mechanization. And in Annie Besant's view, the problem would be solved by what she called the tentative organization of industry by the state, an organization which will soon be followed by the taking over by the community of some of the great trusts. For her, for socialists, for supporters of municipal socialism like Joseph Chamberlain, the municipal employment would be a tipping point that would avoid society from bursting through social class tensions. In that, socialism fitted into a process of increasing state intervention that had become more and more acceptable to industrialists and managers themselves. Sidney Webb was keen to list the areas concerned, testifying to the direct supersession of private enterprise and the fact that now the state registers, inspects, and controls nearly all the industrial functions which has not yet absorbed. Hence the fears expressed by Herbert Spencer in The Man versus the State. All this occurred with the economic agent's sanction, regardless of ideological or intellectual considerations. Caring for none of these things, Webb wrote, the practical man is irresistibly driven in the same direction. Now, this also implied implied that socialism endorsed another liberal tenet, which was that of democracy. For Shaw and for Webb, as for other Fabians, for instance, collective ownership was the outcome of popular sovereignty, the latter declaring, Sidney Webb, that the mainstream which has borne European society towards socialism during the past 100 years is the irresistible progress of democracy. A last feature of the socialist critique lay in the invocation of individuality as opposed to individualism. The system of private ownership combined with unfettered competition resulted in a deterioration of human nature, not only in physical, but also in mental and moral terms. For Robert Blatchford, the improvement of the material aspects of life went along with a growing sense of community life. Socialism would teach and train all children wisely. It would foster genius and devotion to the common good. It would kill scamping and loafing and gerrymandering. It would give us better health, better homes, better work, better food, better lives, and better men and women. Targeting capitalist enterprise on an international scale, William Clark actually pitted economic and technical progress against what he deemed was the disaster of its social, moral, and cultural implications. Referring to breakthroughs in transport and communication, he noted that, quote, the capitalist class has become cosmopolitan, has broken up old habits, destroyed all the local associations, spared nothing either beautiful or venerable where profit was concerned. it has assimilated the conditions of life in various lands and has brought about a general uniformity, which accounts for much of the ennui felt in modern life. This argument, of course, formed the linchpin of ethical socialism as well as the new liberalism, considering that individual development was intertwined with that of the community. Edward Carpenter believed, for instance, that the simultaneous growth of private property and powers of production alienated man, one, from nature, two, from his true self, three, from his fellows. The idea of a debasement of human nature by capitalism was also to be found in the aesthetics of John Ruskin, in whose footsteps Carpenter followed. Ruskin was an ongoing connection between social conditions and the sense of beauty which capitalism tended to debase. In other instances, this holism took the form of an organicist plea for collective ownership, on the ground that man's aspirations could only thrive within a cooperative society where each individual contributed to the common enterprise. The Webb's celebration of industrialism and state socialism was, in that sense, a form of organicism in itself, merging biology and technical development into one single plea for collective ownership. Both the modern factory and the social body relied on the interdependence of their parts rather than on self-destructive competition. Yet another version of this ethical conception of freedom that collective ownership would allow was to be found, of course, among the Christian socialists, heirs to F.D. Maurice and Charles Kingsley. For Stuart Headlam, rather than a scheme of expropriation, socialism was about salvation through deeds, with the parable of the rich man showing that he was in hell not simply because he was rich, but simply because he allowed the contrast between rich and poor to go on as a matter of course, day after day, without taking any pains to end it. Work and works, on this view, were merged into one single program of spiritual development and freedom. And if, again, you want a rough description of the object of Christian socialism, Stuart Headlam wrote, I should say that it was to bring about the time when all shall work, and when all working, work will be a joy instead of the grind it is at present, and to bring about the time when the robbers shall be utterly abolished. In other words, socialism was presented by its proponents as a materialization of the liberal agenda, in that it ended political slavery, the rule of a privileged minority, economic slavery, exploitation of the proletarian by a privileged elite, and moral slavery, the corruption of society by a dogma of profit-making and individualist gratification, rather than true emancipation within the community. So it's two, in fact, conservative socialism, a second section. In a number of ways, however, the call for collective ownership, although it drew on liberal ideals, was also predicated on conservative tenets. One should specify that all those tenets that Jerry Moller sought to articulate in particular were not held simultaneously by committed socialists, but they were taken individually. This, nevertheless, made socialism compatible with a conservative mindset, and even sometimes with a conservative policy. The first meeting ground between late 19th century socialists and conservatism could be found in the commitment to experience and continuity, inherent, in fact, in the organicist paradigm, as opposed to a hard-nosed liberal agenda that promoted rational calculation, individualism, and competition. going by the principle put forward by Michael Oakeshott that, quote, to be conservative then is to prefer the tried to the untried, fact to mystery, the actual to the possible, the familiar to the unfamiliar. A number of socialists were conservative in that they sought to establish the continuity of collective ownership with the past, the familiarity of socialism. This could be seen in different ways, notably with their stress on preserving institutions among the socialist reformers of the gradualist trend. Shaw's celebration of social democracy was poles apart from a disruptive revolutionary agenda. He built upon past and consensual developments that relied on the will of the majority rather than on coercion and a tabula rasa reconstruction. He concluded his essay Transition to Social Democracy in the following way. This, then, is the humdrum program of the practical social democrat today. There is not one new item in it. All are applications of principles already admitted and extension of practices already in full activity. All have on them that stamp of the vestry which is so congenial to the British mind. None of them compel the use of the word socialism or revolution. At no point do they involve guillotining, declaring the rights of man, swearing on the altar of the country, or anything else that is supposed to be essentially un-English. And they are all sure to come. Landmarks on our course already visible to far-sighted politicians, even of the party which dreads them. So here, the politically or potentially divisive nature of collectivism was, to borrow from Michael Friedman's terminology, decontested. Being part of a process or a practice that had proved effective and acceptable, it was rooted in historical practice and experience. So, of course, the underlying strategy in this advertising of collective ownership was meant to echo the liberal William Harcourt's popular phrase, "We are all socialists now." But from another perspective, Shaw was also drawing on a more conservative standpoint, as it were, by nationalizing the very notion of socialism, rooting it in a supposedly English tradition. First of all, by contrast with continental Marxism, as Cardinal Manning had claimed, I cannot be a socialist being an Englishman and socialism having no existence in England, unquote. But also by contrast with revolutionary France. In this, there was a Burkean legacy in the organicist plea for collectivism. This embracing of the democratic state as a means to achieve socialism was precisely what led the labor movement to voice suspicion towards the somewhat moderate socialism of Keir Hardie. For the founder of the Labour Party, whose compromise with the liberals in the early 20th century appeared to some as a betrayal, institutions were not, as such, bourgeois legacies that should be thrown off. The engine of socialism lay in the reforms of, rather, the voters' consciences. The socialists, therefore, recognizing that the state is but the expression of the will of the people, accepts it as an existing fact and seeks by means of the education of the electorate to change the conception upon which the state at present rests and the functions which it exercises. Public morality, therefore, was a prerequisite for public policy. This standpoint foreshadowed Lord Cecil's assertion in his essay on conservatism that, quote, there was no antithesis between conservatism and socialism, or even between conservatism and liberalism. Rejecting any dogma or general formula, Cecil believed that enlarging the function of the state beyond the mere absence of unjust treatment might be envisaged by being prudently distrustful of the untried and preferring to develop what exists rather than to demolish and reconstruct, or by a preference for what exists and has been tried over the unknown. Another conservative dimension of socialism was its attempt to harness progress to history, thereby again matching Burke's conception of the state as a flexible entity combining change and tradition. With his gradualist vindication of collective ownership, and alongside his commitment to liberal tenets, Webb was keen to ground socialism in a whole tradition of British critics of philosophic radicalism. Owen, of course, but also Coleridge and De Quincey, Carlyle, Morris, Kingsley, Ruskin. Even when they were not gradualists as such, socialists frequently invoked a national traditional resistance. For Hardy, the labor and trade union movements were the heirs to a long list of leading figures: Wycliffe, John Ball, Winstanley, Sir Thomas More, Owen, Ernest Jones, etc., etc. Such instances fueled his conviction that, quote, the mold from which these social giants was formed cannot have been altogether destroyed. And so the impetus for revolution for the most radical of the socialists could also be fueled by a working class legacy, by drawing upon a glorious past of revolutionaries, foreshadowing in that way Georges Sorel's conservative revolutionism. For instance, while advertising his Marxist loyalties, William Morris, by writing his Utopia, relied precisely on imagination and narrative to spread his socialist ideas. From this perspective, the switch to a collectivist society was both a break in history regarding economic interactions between individuals, but also the endorsement of a national tradition, of a labor culture that had developed over the centuries, reference to which could allow to reconcile political effectiveness or agency with a working class culture and working class aesthetics. In the lesser arts, William Morris invoked not only the contemplation of England's history, but saw in the consideration of England's past as an inspirational response to contemporary evils. When we think what a small part of the world's history, past, present, and to come, is this land we live in, and how much smaller still in the history of the arts, and yet how our forefathers clung to it, and with what care and pains they adorned it, this unromantic, uneventful-looking land of England, surely by this too, our hearts may be touched and our hope quickened. So for reasons of time, I think I'll be moving on to the last part, to the final element that I wanted to make about the conservative legacy of socialists, which is that their stress on human imperfection. Of course, the emphasis on human evilness was more or less perceptible and could vary from one theorist to another. Also from within, or at least within the output of one single socialist advocate. But the celebration of progress was frequently watered down by a critique of human nature. For Shaw, for instance, deeply rooted in individuals was the propensity to seek the easiest ways of making a fortune without the least effort. As against socialism, he wrote in one of his essays, the gambling spirit urges man to allow no rival to come between his private individual powers and stepmother earth, but rather to secure some acres of her and take his chance of getting diamonds instead of cabbages. This is private property, or unsocialism. Socialism, in this sense, amounted to a safeguard from the dangers of natural corruption. The continuation of institutions contradicted an idealized Rousseau-based conception of the noble savage, and socialism provided a permanent protection from the selfish leanings of the individual. This meant, of course, distancing oneself from the Marxian belief in the withering of the state, but it also implied rejecting anarchism as it was developed by Peter Kropotkin in his Mutual Aid, A Factor in Evolution in 1902, and by his mouthpiece, a fellow Fabian, Charlotte Wilson. In her essay published in 1886, she contended that both property and authority had been obstacles to the moral development of the individual and to making organic society a realizable society. Doing away with the state, she believed, alongside capitalist monopoly, would enable each worker to be entirely free to do as nature prompts, etc., etc. This meant doing away with all coercive organization, working with machine-like regularity. Now, against this idealized conception of nature as a basis for social reconstruction, the Fabians eventually adopted in the 1880s, after passionate debates, the view summed up by Shaw in The Impossibilities of Anarchism in 1891. This view was, quote, that government and institutions are inherent in society itself and must be submitted to with the help of such protection against their abuse as democratic institutions, more than any others, can afford. We must put up with the state. Now, I won't labor the point, so to speak, but I might also focus on other socialists, the ethical socialists, who were very keen to note that even under socialism, cooperation would not mean precisely passiveness, but it still entailed some form of agency, moral responsibility to work, and moral responsibility to improve the world. Therefore, leaving room for the possibility of moral choice, rather than idealizing human nature as being free from corrupting institutions. So now I'd like to perhaps examine what this merger, or attempt at merging ingredients of liberalism, ingredients of conservatism could entail when this was operated in the name of collective ownership. The first difficulty that socialists were confronted with related to coercion, the use of force. Defining individuals' emancipation through their participation in the actions of the social organism implied that freedom was constrained by the tasks set by industrial society. This could be seen, for instance, in Annie Besant's definition of individual fulfillment in terms of contribution to the needs of the community. Of course, a collectivist society would allow to improve working conditions. It would allow to use machinery efficiently for the common good. However, Besant did not define the common good in terms of political decision-making, but in terms of economic necessity. For instance, the ability of individuals to choose their occupation would, it might happen, be limited by the demand for the goods that would result from socialism. So, at one time or other, individuals would have to meet the demands of the community. So while reconciling the liberal principle of rationality with the conservative one of community, Besant's outlook suggested that defining freedom according to the needs of society came first before defining freedom as an absolute. The ominous implications of this relativism could be seen in her discussion of the incentive to work in a collectivist society. Under socialism, there would, of course, be a resurgence of the esprit de corps that the gold hunger had erased in capitalist society. People would be pleased to work together, to perform good work, to contribute to the well-being of their neighbors. But she also asserted that, quote, the general stimulus to labor will be, in the first place, then as now, the starvation which would follow the cessation of labor, unquote. So this incentive, as it were, amounted to a simultaneous celebration of the laissez-faire survival of the fittest idea and of a romantic essentialized community at the expense of individual deliberation. A similar risk of coercion could be found in Heinemann's call for state intervention in the name of an idealized people that brushed aside pluralism. The state, as the organized common sense of public opinion, must step in, regardless of greed or prejudice, to regulate that nominal individual freedom which simply strengthens the domination of the few. Here, the capitalist minority were opposed to a supposedly harmonious and monolithic community deemed to serve the interests of the individual fairly. On this view, political and moral deliberation and discussion about the extent of the state's actions, the opportunity and degree of intervention, of what the meaning of social justice, were secondary from the moment public opinion was embodied by the socialist state. Along this line of thought, there was no room for Mill's fear of conformism or Tocqueville's critique of the tyranny of the majority. But Heinemann's democracy, for that matter, was also an embodiment of Fitzjames Stephen's criticism of Mill, as well as of universal suffrage as a whole, when he argued that democracy might guarantee equality rather than liberty. I won't read perhaps the whole section I had planned, but Stephen declares, changes in the form of a government alter the conditions of superiority much more than its nature. There are different types of domination, to put it simply. The other challenge facing socialists was that of intellectual despotism, resulting from the combination of liberal faith in emancipatory knowledge and the conservative principle of hierarchy and tradition. So in their critique of capitalism, there was definitely an appeal to the efficiency of reform as a first step towards collective ownership. We noted that something conceptual about the move towards gradual collectivism. Yet this process, however inevitable, needed to be understood. It needed to be made sense of. Precisely because of their practical nature, those social and historical developments needed explaining. Reforms, the implications of technological improvements, developments in cultural and mental representations had to be interpreted before society became conscious that it was actually practicing socialism. In effect, the function of the socialist as an intellectual who collected and classified facts was to catalyze progress. To paraphrase Karl Löwit, the socialist would spell out meaning in history and therefore complete the dynamics of the Industrial Revolution on a cultural but perhaps even anthropological level. Sidney Webb, for instance, took on the task of linking up the industrial, political, intellectual developments that had been underway since the 18th century, with facts proving that the inevitability of socialism, knowledge, de facto, established the authority of the expert who interpreted them and ordered them. There was, Webb wrote, quote, no apparent prospect of a slackening of the pace of this unconscious abandonment of individualism, unquote. And so the history-based plea for socialism was a response to what he called the general failure to realize the extent to which our unconscious socialism has already proceeded. And so we reach this paradox where, although Webb invoked reason, pragmatism, experience, the fostering of collective ownership ultimately depended on the public's trust in sociology and history as a key to self-understanding. At the end of the day, this approach was in effect quite in keeping with the speculations of his political ally, Arthur Balfour. In The Foundations of Belief in 1895, Balfour extolled philosophic doubt and rejected naturalism or scientism, which would at first sight seem to be at odds with Webb's evolutionism. Yet at the same time, Balfour contended that it is authority rather than reason which lays deep the foundations of social life. It is authority rather than reason which cements its superstructure. Webb occupied precisely that position, that posture of the socialist prophet, enlightening his contemporaries and voicing authority. Such a coexistence perhaps I'll skip another example I was hoping to give, perhaps to focus on the last difficulty encountered by socialists trying to merge liberalism and conservatism, which was the risk of a bureaucratic state. This risk could be perceived in Robert Blatchford's celebration of socialism in terms of conversion to an idea rather than participation in the management of the nation's business. In Merry England, Blatchford wrote, "When your public understands socialism and desires to establish it, there will be no difficulty about plans. Just get a number of your clever organizers and administrators into committee and let them formulate a scheme." Blatchford saw in the cleverness or efficiency of organizers the condition for socialism to function. And underlying his outlook was the belief that they would necessarily be dedicated to the common good. The main hurdle to socialism, in Blatchford's view, was the potential reluctance to the principle, the implementation being a matter of simple efficiency rather than political discussion. So here, the combination of the liberal rational enterprise and, on the other hand, of the conservative sense of trust and duty resulted in what Max Weber described as charismatic rule within bureaucracy. And indeed, this was possible precisely because both conservatism and liberalism stressed the need for institutions, whether a constitution, the legal protection of people and property, the regulation of trade, or the enforcement of contracts. All of these implied, at some time or other, public officials whose function required trust as well as efficiency. Applied to state monopoly, this could result in administrative despotism, since economic organization determined political relationships. There would be other implications of this bureaucracy in terms of international affairs. Because the very existence of the empire was not systematically questioned by socialists. Some socialists disapproved of the Boer War intervention, but others did not object to it because they believed in the necessity for the empire. The empire as a conveyor belt for the promotion of civilization, for the promotion of socialism, and therefore the existence of a structure, of an institution as a prerequisite for socialist ideas to be materialized. In Fabianism and the Empire, Bernard Shaw, in the name of the society, after much heated debate, wrote that, quote, civilization must follow the flag. And it is becoming more and more our concern that no flag that does not carry a reasonable standard of life with it shall be the flag of a great power. So, of course, there was the question of moralizing the empire. There was a question of socializing the empire. But nothing could be done, according to Bernard Shaw, and this, of course, brought him closer to the liberal unionists and to the conservatives. Nothing could be done if the empire was dismantled in the first place. So, in a way, the fear, the reluctance towards liberal or laissez-faire chaos was transferred to the international scene in terms of the necessity to preserve some form of balance, continuity, stability, with, of course, an implication of coercion and force. So in his study, that's my concluding perhaps point, in his study on European liberalism, Gerald Seigel showed how inconsistent ideologies could be. His point was notably that liberalism in the 19th century had fostered industrial society, rationality, individualism, democracy, but also in its various practices and theorizations contradicted each one of these objectives at some time or other, contradicted each one of these ideas in one case or another. Similar comments might be formulated about conservatism, celebrating aristocratic domination, tradition, interventionism, protection, democracy, community. Socialism, as we saw it in this paper, apart from being itself a conflation of possibly competing and contradictory projects, revealed in the late 19th century how liberalism and conservatism, though often opposed, could overlap. We also saw that being flexible, socialism was able to absorb those ideologies to a point, that it was able to absorb their strengths, but also their flaws and ambiguities. It would seem that similar challenges, of course, are facing contemporary society, when alternatives are being suggested, very often in worrying or simplistic ways, alternatives suggested to overcome ideological divides. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Right, restoring my sound. Thank you very much, Stéphane, for this rich presentation. You've given us a compelling account of these internal tensions in late 19th century socialism, that complex, ambivalent dialogue with both liberalism and conservatism. I think your talk has opened up a wide range of questions about ideology, progress, moral choice, common good, political identity that resonate well beyond the historical period you examined. I was very interested. Can I just, before I open the floor to questions, I was very interested in what you said about the need for functioning institutions and the risk of excessive bureaucracy. Was that all extracted from Heinemann, or the quotes that you gave us on that topic?
Yeah, I think, well, Heinemann, yes, and I think virtually all those socialists who, of course, might vary according to the, depending on the timeline, what was working, what was not working, were things working now, would things work in the future. But the principle of a well-organized industrial community, that I think was shared by a number of socialists from different backgrounds or traditions. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So we now have time for discussion. So let's open the floor to questions and comments from the audience. If you'd like to speak, please feel free to raise your virtual hand or post your question in the chat. I'll do my best to moderate. Catherine will go first. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Stéphane. It was very interesting. And so I've got two questions. The first one is that I was really interested in what you said about Beatrice Webb and her user Spencer. And I was wondering to what extent you could actually perhaps say a word more about this, the fact that she had recognized his use of the earth as a collective good. If you perhaps could say a bit more about how she actually understood his work, that I thought that this was really interesting. And then the second question is do you think that in new liberalism, there is a type of compromise between Victorian liberalism and conservatism, the way you described it? I was really thinking about this at the end, and it's a question I'm really wondering, especially in the new liberalism of somebody like Hobhouse, especially. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Catherine. Yes, so about your first question, well, so Beatrice Webb, so there's the biographical dimension, which is that Herbert Spencer was a very close friend of her family's. He saw her as a child, and so there was a close relationship. But also, she repeatedly said that she owed him a number of things, but I think one of the things that she admired in him and that she took up for her own view of socialism was the idea of differentiation, the idea of complexification of society, and the idea of society as an organism.
Yeah.
So that definitely, of course, blurs the boundaries a bit between socialism as the antithesis of Herbert Spencer libertarianism. If we consider that for Beatrice Webb, socialism was just an outgrowth of the organism, the social organism, then of course there are lots of possible connections with the libertarian, the anarchist, viewpoint. Okay, yeah. So that would be my reply. And so the other point about this conservatism and new liberalism. Yeah, well, of course. I mean, if we think of those who inspired the new liberals, the idealists, of course, we have the left wingers and the right wingers. Bosanquet being the epitome of the conservative idealist.
Yeah.
And it's true to say that for some thinkers of liberalism, well, the idealism was for Berlin, for instance, for Karl Popper, for Thalmann. New liberalism was a form of proto-totalitarianism, in the sense that it sought to define the common good, to spell out what the common good should be, and that was the beginning. Of course, there were connections with Hayek's fear of interventionism as being well-meaning, but eventually leading to let's say a domination of the state. Okay, so yes, liberalism as an opponent to new liberalism socialism and perhaps considering them as conservatives. Yes, and perhaps just to link up your two questions, of course, one of the criticisms voiced by Herbert Spencer towards the Conservative Party was that they were, towards the Liberal government rather, was that they were becoming, he argued, increasingly Tory. They were becoming Tory, so not so much socialists as Tories.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you. Stéphane Guy.
Yeah, sorry, problem with my micro. Thank you very much, Stéphane, for your fascinating presentation. I think that's a very good way to reconsider socialism at the end of the 19th century. I've got a question for you, and sorry if my question sounds naive, because I'm not a specialist of the 19th century in Britain and not a specialist of socialism. What about Disraeli? Were some socialists interested in some of his ideas, and especially in the 1880s when he was prime minister and he moved to what was going to be called One Nation conservatism, or not at all?
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Stéphane. Yeah. So of course, definitely he was in the background. And as I said, people like Ruskin definitely had him in mind when they said that they were Tories. There were other socialists who claimed to be Tories, who advocated the Tory legacy. But all the same, I think one of the driving arguments of socialists was to try and show that they were breaking away from privilege, okay, and so from paternalism, okay, at least in the way in which the case was made for socialism. And so the role of the aristocracy, that seemed something of the past. Now, what I tried to show was that there was a form of conservatism that was not necessarily based on people, but more a mode of thinking, and which left room for the resurfacing of a form of aristocratic via intellectual rule. Okay, so I think Disraeli was mentioned, but really incidentally, rather than as taken in as a forefather of socialism. This would be my tendency, but there might be things to explore that matter.
Thank you.
Thank you. Emmanuel Pechon.
Yeah, hello, thank you very much. And hello, Stéphane, good to see you. I was wondering if you could say a bit more about how your research fits into the contemporary interpretations of political movements. It's a broad question, but
well, I mean, yeah. Thanks, Emmanuel. Well, I think I just touched upon that very briefly when I was referring to the blurring of those categories that is, let's say, operated, or at least that is taking place with populism. Okay, drawing on the different traditions. I think there's definitely a form of echo to the problems that were raised in the late 19th century in terms of rejection of elitism. At the same time, so I mean, perhaps the neoliberalism considered to be the brainchild of an elite, of an intellectual elite, and then a form of populism that claims to speak in the name of the people, And so that tension between liberalism and socialism, I think, has been let's say, addressed by perhaps post-liberalism, people like Adrian Pabst, okay, trying to reconcile, to try and find a happy, a third way. So not a third way in the Tony Blair sense, but a third way between liberalism and socialism, in the sense that trying to restore a form of civic morality, okay, based on Aristotelian ethos, and so trying to move away from perhaps just the conception of progress based on economics or material progress or technological progress, or even rights, and a conception of progress based on values. Okay, there would be people like, of course, there's blue labor, of course. Let's try to propose some things, but of course with certain, let's say, certain positions that have been a bit disturbing in recent months. So, but that might be one let's say, debate that's going on within the left, which I think echoes some of the things that I addressed in the paper.
Thank you very much. Do we have further questions? Catherine?
Yeah, if there isn't another question, I was just thinking, I was really interested in what you said about the idea of progress, and I'm wondering to what extent today, and I know that we're bringing in the idea into the 21st century, but because there are no more questions, perhaps it's a good thing to do, but I'm wondering to what extent today hardcore socialists still do believe in this notion of progress in the same way. And I was wondering what really made them perhaps not believe in it in the same way. Was it because in fact times has changed, and in fact there is a feeling that perhaps we cannot expect much more about the future? I'm wondering. I'm thinking about somebody like Jeremy Corbyn. He doesn't actually have at the heart of his socialism the notion of progress. I don't think so. I don't know what you think. What do you think about this? I was wondering.
Well, Corbyn's interesting. I think he has tried to reconcile the two lefts. I mean, the new left focusing on the individual rights, let's see, social rights, minorities, etc., and the old style collectivist socialism that he's always claimed to represent. So, but there again, you see, I think, yes, in Corbyn, there is the idea of progress as a restoration of something that has been lost, a bit like for Ken Loach. Again, the spirit of 45 was about retrieving what Thatcherism had supposedly destroyed. So there is that to and fro between even in Corbyn, between the future and the past. Yeah. But I think, there is also he's also very careful not to be too assertive as to what the future society will be beyond such and such an advantage for such and such a group. Okay, because politically, of course, it would be rather clumsy to want to be too specific about what society will necessarily be once he's become prime minister.
Yeah,
that materializes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Do we have any questions left? Just scanning the floor. Stéphane Porion?
Right, maybe another one, because Catherine opened the way to the 20th century or even later. When the Labour Party got into power in 1945, that time with an overall majority, and they could exercise power, do you think because of the reality of exercising power, they had to change parts of their ideas, even though the party had written up its constitution in 1918, or do we have this intellectual legacy of what you said, late 19th century Britain, or even at the turn of the 20th century?
Yeah, thank you, Stéphane. Yeah, well, I think it's an ongoing debate, really. I mean, we can try and identify several, let's say, debates, discussions, conversations that went on at different times in different terms. I mean, Harold Wilson's criticism that taking clause 4 would be out of the Constitution would be removing Genesis from the Bible. Yeah. But I think there's always been that tension in the Labour Party, perhaps even in socialism generally, between the long-term ideal of collective ownership and the way to get there, and how long it would take. There's the question of temporality, which I think is crucial here. Within what timeline? How long should we wait? How fast should the changes be implemented? And so, in post-World War II, well, of course, there was the debate of the prescription charge, but I mean, all this stimulated by the cost of the Labour programme. There were the ideals of the Constitution. Then there was the democratic dimension, which was that things couldn't be done overnight. Expropriation was out of the question. And then there was also that economic difficulty, which was that in practice, the cost of the welfare state required more public expenses, more contributions on the part of the public. And so all that, I wouldn't say determined the nature of the debate, but we could think that perhaps confronted with the exercise of power, Labour was obliged to face its dilemmas. What should be privileged?
But if you think of the whole wave of nationalizations that they undertook, were they actually happy with the result? Do you think they achieved their intellectual goals or not? Or did they afterwards rethink of this idea of public ownership of the means of production, even though that was Tony Blair later on that who got rid of clause 4?
As a whole, it would be hard to say if they were pleased with it. I mean, definitely the radical left considered that things had not gone far enough. Okay, but then you have all those figures who had been radical when the first Labour government, and who, like Barbara Castle, decided to be more cautious. To say the least, when she published her white paper in place of strife. I think it would be difficult to have an overall view about satisfaction with nationalization. I think there was a spelling out of the ambiguities of nationalization. 20% of public businesses were nationalized, so it wasn't that much. There was still 80% that were left. And then there was, of course, all the talk about the social democratic consensus. That, of course, has been subject to debate as well. We will have to, let's say, prolong this conversation more in detail, perhaps, but there would be lots of different figures to enumerate, I think, each having a different take. Yeah.
Okay, so we see you next year, Stéphane. Thank you.
Okay, right. A new paper.
Thank you. Belkis?
Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Thank you very much for your thought-provoking talk. I was wondering whether some of the similarities that you've discussed between 19th century socialists and conservatives conservative ways of thinking might be explained by the fact that both were responding to the same problem, the arrival of mass democracy and the extension of the franchise. And while, of course, as you know, this context famously fueled the conservative anxieties about disintegration and social disintegration, you've mentioned Lord Salisbury and his 1883 text about social disintegration. It also seems to have encouraged many socialist thinkers to privilege and to defend continuity, cohesion, historical development over radical change. Do you think this fear of democracy and this shared fear of democracy helps explain why, in the British context, socialism and conservatism sometimes appear to converge, despite, of course, the major ideological differences?
Thank you very much. I would include in that paradigm also liberalism. Okay, definitely, so that there were all those. If we see things sociologically, I mean, there was that educated middle class that saw that was struggling to come to terms with an influx of new voters, and perhaps trying to rein public opinion, to try and direct it. So with the underlying or the hovering fear that there could be danger, that the masses might be erratic. Le Bon, of course, was a key theorist of that, the fear of the masses, and people like George Gissing, of course, in fiction, who was very critical of mass culture. Yes, definitely. I think there was that dimension to something that brought them together. Possibly with, of course, competing views of democracy. Is democracy about suffrage, or is it about, as Mill, of course, argued, that there should be something, the education competence should be given weight? Okay, and so that, to my mind, there's I'm talking about the liberal, but the liberal who had some conservative apprehensions about mass democracy. And in the same way, knowledge. That was one of my, points. I think knowledge acted as a very convenient, rhetoric, because it both encouraged the emancipation of the masses. They should be encouraged to learn, and therefore to become responsible voters. But at the same time, it legitimized those who actually held knowledge and who were de facto in a position of advice, superiority, paternalism, etc. So yes, and of course, so conservatism, of course, has sought on many occasions to try to either reject, but then it was becoming, of course, much more of a minority position, reject suffrage. The other view was to try and include the masses in those popular organizations, because after all, there was a popular support for conservative ideology, whatever the labor movement, however much it may have spread. There was also that competing culture of conservatism, which was gaining traction. The khaki elections are a case in point, 1900.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Belkis. Thank you, Stéphane. I'm keeping an eye on the time. I don't know whether we have any further questions. I think we've the timing is perfect. We've used our time. So thank you to everyone who contributed to the discussion, and especially to our speaker, Stéphane Guy, for such an insightful and stimulating seminar. Thank you. Before we close, let me briefly announce our next session in this seminar series. It will take place on 13 February And we will be delighted to welcome Christopher Fear from the University of Hull, who will speak on inside right conservatism versus Ferrarism in the 2020s. This will be held in person at the Maison de la Recherche, Sorbonne Nouvelle, Central Paris, and online. So we very much hope to see you again. Until then, I wish you all a very good rest of the day. Thank you, Stéphane. Thank you all.
Thank you.
And bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Laurence. Thank you, Stéphane.
Bye.